Hello friends, my name is Sexbad. Welcome to my first digital painting walkthrough. I'll be going over the work I put into this picture of Kahlo and Voss from Beastars, from sketch to finishing details. Now I don't have formal art education, and this is my first video of this kind, so it may not be the most informative. I don't want to call it a tutorial, but rather an overview of what goes into my pictures. My process is a little chaotic, and I don't explain every step in detail. Nevertheless, I'll go over the broad steps I took for this picture, and focus on a couple of cool details, as well as mistakes that I noticed in hindsight. I was inspired by the difference in size between Kahlo and Voss, who are usually seen hanging out together in the Beastars comic. I usually default to full nudity in my art, but I think I struck gold with the idea of Voss fitting inside Kahlo's underwear. The sketch process is certainly the first chaotic part, and I don't have too much to say about my initial figure drawing stage of the picture. I don't reliably use the construction shapes that you may see other artists working with to make their characters' body parts, but I'm gradually working those into some tougher sketches more often now, and it helps. I at least had a good idea in my head of how I wanted both characters posed, and from what angle. I wanted the viewer to feel like they're between Voss and Kahlo's eye levels, so I had to draw Kahlo's snout slightly upturned, and Voss's slightly lowered, looking up. This point of view also allowed me to draw Kahlo seated crossover style, with his legs mostly parallel to the floor, yet with a good amount of room to show his underwear. I raised one arm and kept the other supporting Kahlo behind his back, and it's good both for contrapposto and for showing off an armpit, which some furries really vocally love. I usually draw nipples on my characters, but I decided that Kahlo's shaggy fur will cover his. For both characters, I drew their feet close to the style commonly seen in the comic. They're really just human feet with claws and no paw pads. I decided that Kahlo's penis should be easy to spot through the wrinkles of the briefs he's wearing, but most of the details on the briefs come from Voss's interaction with them. Voss is holding onto the waistband like it's a banister, turning it upside down and wrinkling the fabric just underneath it. His right leg is also creating a bulge, just above Kahlo's penis. I drew this sketch without a specific background in mind, and I would have been satisfied with a very basic color background, I think. However, I had the idea to check VR chat to see if anyone had recreated Room 701, Legoshi's room from Beastars. I found just that, created by a user named Takato Matsuki, who appears to specialize in recreating environments from a lot of animes. I went in and took a handful of screenshots from angles that I thought might line up with the perspective of the sketch. I chose one that kind of did, and I traced over the basic layout of it. However, I made a big mistake that I didn't notice until I was nearly finished with the picture. With the character's position against the background, Kahlo might be 10 feet tall or more. Even sitting down, his head about reaches the height of the ladder behind him. I think that might not be too easy to notice. Hopefully you didn't spot it before I mentioned it. But if I'd noticed it before I painted so much, I would have enlarged the background. In its current state, it's a sneaky bit of forced perspective. I added in a splash of gray under the sketch of the characters, just to distinguish them from background colors, and then quickly switched focus to the basic colors and lighting of the background. I decided on warm afternoon sunlight, with part of the window's frame shading Voss's face. I then went back to the characters and made another layer to show where I initially thought the sunlight should be hitting them. I used a clipping mask on that layer to avoid the sunlight bleeding over the edges of the characters. It's worth noting that the left side of Kahlo's chest, our right, is closer to the window, so the sunlight hits it higher than the right side, our left. Returning to the background, I started on the bunks. I eyeballed the curves at the tops of their frames, and then I created layers underneath those frames to color the insides of the bunks. To give the scene more depth, I began to work on bounce lighting. Sunlight was primarily hitting the bright orange rug at the center of the room, so prominent shaded parts of the picture had to have some of that orange light reflected onto them. This mostly means the back wall, the ceilings of the bunks on that wall, and just above Kahlo's shoulders. I made sure to darken the shaded parts of the characters that weren't receiving much bounce light. In Clip Studio Paint, I do most of my digital painting with mixing brushes, meaning that they drop paint in the color I've selected, but they also smudge the colors that are already present on the layer I'm painting. This is great for broad, subtle color effects, like bounce lighting. For the bounce lighting here, I selected the bright orange of the rug, and then brightened it up a little more. Then I applied it very gently with mixing brushes, and the occasional large circular feather brush. I merged the highlight layer with Kahlo's main color layer, and then began to brighten his highlights further. Then I made separate layers for Voss and the underwear, and gave them colors that reflect their basic exposure to sunlight as well. I started to add bounce light and shadowy spots to Kahlo's smaller shaded areas. More of Kahlo's facial details followed. I gave him a tongue with a pronounced edge. I made his upper teeth too visible for the expression that I was going for, so I reduced them. I also figured that I had enough basic shading down to begin adding scruffy fur detail to his face. This was mostly on his muzzle and the fur covering his eyes. I used a mixing brush with a couple of speckles instead of one big flat brush shape in order to make wavy tufts of fur. I also used a plain old pencil tool to add some texture and errant strands along the silhouette. To better pronounce the direction of the bounce lighting, I gave Kahlo a shadow on his neck and above his clavicle. Following this, I added similar details to most of his upper body. I wasn't sure whether to make Kahlo's briefs lighter or darker than his fur, but I had thought that they should be white or off-white. During my live stream, a viewer suggested to make them black. This turned out well because the dark color provided a good contrast against the character's body, while still having a lot of visible detail thanks to the direct sunlight. Most of the underwear here is actually a warm gray, with clearly visible dark wrinkles and folds. Next came the legs and feet, which are closest to the viewer, so of course they require a good amount of care. I darkened the spaces between his toes, refined the shape of his feet, and smoothed out a lot of the fur on his legs with mixing brushes again. I gave Kahlo some claws with a harder brush, and then added a shine to them and blended them in with the tips of his toes using a softer mixing brush. Before getting back to work on Kahlo's upper body, I added some shadow detail on him around Voss's body. Unfortunately, these shadows don't line up entirely right, and I didn't change them much later on. I used more mixing brushes on his upper body to provide better texture to his fur, and also to fluff up his silhouette. One of the most charming things about Paru Itagaki's art style is just how fluffy most of her mammal characters are. So surely I had to go fluffier than my usual, with an Old English sheepdog from Beastars. I then began to work on Voss's features. The work I did on him is sort of a microcosm of all the things I did with Kahlo so far. It's about the same process: basic shapes for facial features, highlighting the well-lit parts, darkening shaded contours, and so on. But because Voss is much smaller, he requires less detail. I gave him big eyes with just a little bit of visible color and sclera. The color of his irises is drowned out by the reflections of the afternoon sky in his pupils. I also reshaped and detailed his feet to look more humanoid, just like his large friend. And because of his shorter fur, I gave him visible nipples. It's hard to tell as I rewatched the painting process, but somewhere along the way, I had a problem with the shape of Voss's face. He looked too dog-like, possibly like a chihuahua, and I remedied this by sharpening his cheeks a bit and reducing the top of his head. In a layer above Voss, I added some fluff from Kahlo's thighs to cover up a bit of his legs and elbow. Now I decided it was time to tweak Kahlo's big head of hair a bit more. Nothing to write home about. Satisfied with the characters, I moved on to the background. I started with the rug they're sitting on, using a texture brush to give it a bit of noise, and then scrambling the hard edges on it with a mixing brush. Quick detour on the tip of Kahlo's tail. I realized that it couldn't be lit all the way by the sun, so I shaded the very end of it. The background is relatively simple. I began by drawing lines between the individual planks on the floor, before I could forget to. These lines were on a separate layer, and I locked the transparency on it and painted over it to change the lightness of the lines, dependent on their position in the picture. I added a few more shapes with their own layers to the left of the background, locked their transparencies, and used some very basic shading to make them look realistic enough. It's worth noting that I didn't use actual pure black in the depths of those shelves, or anywhere else in the picture as far as I know. I also believe I didn't make anything completely white, but I could be wrong about that. I used it sparingly regardless. I did some more very basic shading with mixing brushes on the bunks, making sure that the lowest visible parts of the walls inside them were the darkest, because the least amount of bounce light was reaching them. The curtains got a simple alteration between light and dark green to represent their folds. I made sure to make the shadow of the latter a little wavy on the curtain underneath it. I finished off with a few paw prints above one of the bunks. The smaller ones were just copied and pasted from the first one, and a few miscellaneous final details and a logo, second snout, for the underwear. I didn't record this, but for the logo, I rasterized some text and then used the Mesh Transform tool on it to run it along the waistband. To make it a little bit rougher, I ran a pencil tool along some of the edges of the text. For my last touch, I used the eyedropper tool to grab the brightest colors of the picture and put them on a layer above everything else with the Add Glow blending mode. True to its name, this layer added a soft glow to the picture. And that's pretty much everything that went into this picture. I hope that you found it interesting or even learned something new from it. If you have any further questions about any aspect of the creation of this picture, please email me at boner@sexbad.gay. Yes, that's a real email address. I don't have anything on the website associated with that domain yet, though. If you have any criticism of my lecture style, or if there's anything more specific that you'd like me to explain in the future, please let me know that way too. Thank you for watching. Happy painting, and keep on tugging.